In 1880, London, the distance between a long, luxurious life and a cold, early grave is exactly 4 miles. If you are born in the grand townhouses of Mayfair, you can expect to live to 67. But walk just 30 minutes east to the tenements of Spitalfields, and your biological clock expires at 22. This isn't just a gap in wealth. It is a violent theft of time. Welcome to the Victorian era, the hyper-capitalist engine room of an empire that doesn't just run on coal, but on the literal years extracted from human lungs. Look at the fog rolling through these streets. To the man in the West End, this yellow pea super is a romantic backdrop for a carriage ride, easily blocked out by heavy velvet curtains and a roaring marble hearth. But to the man in the East End, this isn't weather. It is a chemical assault. It's a toxic soup of unburnt coal and raw sewage that seeps through rotting floorboards, liquefying the lungs of children before they've even learned to read. In this city, the very act of inhaling is a class struggle. We've been taught to see this era through top hats and polite tea parties. Forget that. Today, we are stripping away the romance to see the gears of the machine. We are going to follow 2 men living on the same soil, breathing the same air, but existing in 2 different centuries of human evolution. Because the true horror of the 19th century doesn't happen in a dark alley. It begins the very second these 2 men open their eyes in the morning. One is waking up to start his day. The other is waking up to survive it. Part 2. The Price of Awakening. The gentleman's morning shaving soap costs exactly what the East End factory worker will earn in 30 grueling, bone-crushing days. This isn't merely a disparity in wealth. It is a completely different dimension of human existence, playing out simultaneously across the same few square miles of a single metropolis. Let us examine the exact sensory reality of this awakening. In Mayfair, dawn does not intrude. It is politely invited in. The gentleman opens his eyes to the soft, orchestrated crackle of seasoned oak burning in a marble fireplace. A valet has already moved silently across the thick Persian rugs to drape freshly pressed, silk-lined garments near the radiant heat. The room smells of imported lavender and roasted coffee beans. His body is rested, swathed in high thread-count Egyptian cotton. Now, violently shift the camera a few miles east. The worker wakes up shivering on a mattress stuffed with damp, rotting straw. There is no fire. The ceiling drips with condensation, tainted by the soot of 1,000 chimneys. The air smells of sulfur, unwashed bodies, and despair. His coarse wool coat, still wet from yesterday's agonizing trek, clings to his skin like a heavy, frozen phantom. He isn't waking up to start his day. He is waking up to survive it. The physical toll of yesterday's labor still screams in his joints. Every muscle aches with a deep, lactic fire. The gentleman rings a silver bell for his valet. The worker waits in terror for a sound that will shatter his spine. He lies in the freezing dark, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the inevitable. Imagine waking up on that damp straw, listening for the piercing shriek of the factory whistle. Honestly ask yourself, how many mornings of that sheer terror would it take before your mind completely broke? Yet, surviving the morning is merely the preamble. Now, they must step out into a city meticulously designed to protect one and entirely consume the other. Part 3. The Iron Path. The journey to work in 1880 is a masterclass in physical elevation. One man glides silently above the cobblestones in a hansom cab, while the other is forced to swallow the toxic mud of Spitalfields. The morning commute is where the invisible caste system of Victorian London becomes a physical, undeniable barrier. The gentleman steps out of his polished front door and directly into a private, horse-drawn sanctuary. The leather interior smells of rich tobacco and oiled mahogany. The suspension of the carriage completely absorbs the harsh reality of the street below. He is floating. He is effectively suspended in a mobile fortress, insulated from the chaotic, desperate masses swarming the sidewalks. He watches the city pass by like a silent, moving painting behind glass. But down on the ground, the reality is a brutal, sensory assault. The worker is navigating a treacherous obstacle course of slick cobblestones, deep puddles of horse manure, and the sharp, jagged edges of industrial refuse. He is already burning precious caloric energy just to put one hobnailed boot in front of the other. The freezing rain cuts right through his threadbare coat. The crowds in the East End are so dense, so violently compressed into the narrow lanes, that just maintaining a walking pace requires physical force. He is being battered by the elements and by his fellow desperate citizens. The gentleman is battling nothing but a slight hangover, entirely unaware that the man walking beneath his wheels is already physically destroyed. Before the worker has even reached the gates of his employment, his body has endured a trauma that would send a modern man to a hospital bed. His legs are trembling. His lungs are burning from the smog. He has expended a third of his daily energy simply to arrive at the place that intends to steal the rest. But the suffocating mud of Spitalfields is a paradise compared to the mechanical hell waiting just behind the iron gates. Part 4. The Leviathan's Roar. Inside a St. James's Gentlemen's Club, the loudest sound is the rustle of the Times. Inside the textile mill, the roar of the power loom literally erases human hearing. We are now at the very core of the Victorian economic engine, where the definition of labor splits into two entirely different dimensions. In the quiet sanctuary of the West End Club, the gentleman sinks into a deep leather armchair. The air is still, smelling faintly of expensive cigar smoke and polished mahogany. His environment is completely under his control. His greatest physical exertion is turning a crisp newspaper page or lifting a porcelain teacup. He feels secure, powerful, and utterly insulated. But there is a cruel nuance to this piece. It is entirely funded by a chaotic, violent mechanical heart beating relentlessly just across the river. Step inside the East End textile mill, and the sensory assault is absolute. The wooden floors vibrate so violently they threaten to rattle the teeth in a worker's skull. Hundreds of heavy iron-spinning mules crash back and forth in a synchronized, deafening rhythm of destruction. The noise is a solid, impenetrable wall. You cannot think. You cannot speak. You simply react. The true terror here isn't the threat of a sudden explosion. It is the slow, agonizing realization that the machine is the protagonist, and the human is merely its biological appendage. The iron Leviathan does not tire, it does not weep, and it does not negotiate. The air is thick with flock, fine cotton dust that coats the lungs, turning every breath into a raspy struggle. The heat is kept artificially suffocating to prevent the delicate threads from snapping, leaving the workers drenched in sweat. Every second is a battle against the hypnotic, cyclical motion that actively tries to lull the exhausted mind into a fatal state of relaxation. The gentleman, meanwhile, is mildly annoyed that his tea has gone cold, worrying about the theoretical volatility of his railway shares. He exists in a sterile bubble of theoretical wealth. The worker exists inside the brutal arithmetic of production, knowing fully well that a broken gear will be repaired, while a broken man will simply be discarded. The mind slowly numbs to the deafening noise, but the stomach is an entirely different kind of torture chamber. Part 5. The Poisoned Plate. Midday strikes, bringing a 7-course luncheon with imported French claret for the elite and a penny loaf laced with literal chalk for the poor. The concept of nourishment in 1880 is fundamentally broken, presenting a macabre irony of sustenance that perfectly illustrates the era's divide. In the elite dining rooms of Mayfair, food is an elaborate, hours-long theater of excess. Silver domes are lifted by white-gloved hands to reveal roasted mutton, fresh oysters, and rich, butter-drenched sauces. The gentleman eats not for energy, but for pleasure and status, engaging in polite political debates between bites of pheasant. He is slowly poisoning himself with gout and gluttony, entirely disconnected from the brutal supply chains that brought this feast to his table. That is why the contrast on the factory floor is so sickening. The worker is not eating to enjoy life. He is eating desperately just to keep his trembling hands from slipping into the machinery. He gets exactly 20 minutes sitting on the filthy, vibrating floorboards. But the meager food he can actually afford is a weapon turned against him. The Victorian era was the golden age of completely unregulated, lethal food adulteration. The aggressive whiteness of his cheap bread doesn't come from fine flour, it comes from a loom, a chemical bleach that severely damages the human digestive tract. The weak, tepid tea he drinks to stay awake is artificially colored with toxic copper shavings. He is literally paying his hard-earned pennies to slowly murder his own internal organs. Every single bite is a terrifying compromise with death. The wealthy man meticulously selects his wine vintage. The poor man unknowingly consumes industrial chemicals just to quiet the agonizing, hollow cramps in his gut. Think about your current energy levels. Could your modern body survive even 24 hours running heavy machinery, fueled by absolutely nothing but watered-down tea and chalk dust? The sheer biological resilience required by the working class just to stand upright is mathematically incomprehensible. But the gnawing hunger is quickly overshadowed by the single, terrifying reality of the afternoon shift. Part 6. The Phantom Fear. In the brutal Victorian economy, a gentleman fears a fleeting moment of social embarrassment. A worker fears the half-second lapse in concentration that will pull his arm into the spinning gears. As the long afternoon drags on, the true psychological toll of the era takes a suffocating hold. The stakes of daily existence are wildly, obscenely disproportionate. The gentleman spends his afternoon navigating the delicate, velvet-lined minefield of high society. He worries deeply about a poor investment in foreign bonds, or the sheer horror of missing a crucial social engagement at a grand estate. His fears are abstract, theoretical, and largely driven by ego. This changes everything when we return to the factory floor, where fear operates on a completely different, primal frequency. Here, fear is not a concept. It is a physical, living entity breathing down your neck. The worker is profoundly exhausted. His malnourished muscles are trembling from overexertion. The hypnotic, repetitive blur of the heavy metal belts and the endless back and forth of the shuttles act like a deadly pendulum, actively trying to lull his brain to sleep. We do not need to witness anatomical gore to understand the sheer terror of this environment. The horror is in the anticipation. It is the absolute chilling knowledge that if his heavy, dust-caked eyelids drop for even a fraction of a second, the machine will not hesitate. There are no safety guards. There are no emergency stop buttons. There are absolutely no workers' compensation laws. If the loom catches his ragged sleeve, it is not just a severe injury. It is a permanent financial death sentence. Instant dismissal leads to instant eviction, and eviction means his family will freeze on the street. The pressure crushes the lungs. And then, the absolute worst happens. The relentless, deafening roar of the factory suddenly, inexplicably, grinds to a halt. The silence that follows is not peaceful. It is the most terrifying sound in the world. The dead silence of a machine stopped by a fatal human error. Everyone freezes, waiting to see whose life has just been permanently ruined. A broken loom is simply a business expense. A broken man is thrown directly into the street to starve. As the afternoon finally bleeds into evening, the ultimate escape approaches. But salvation looks very different, depending on the thickness of your wallet. Part 7. Shadows and Gaslight. When the factory whistle finally blows, the gentleman steps into the brilliant electric glow of the West End Theatre, while the worker collapses into the suffocating darkness of a slum. As the sun drops below the smog line, the pacing of the city dramatically shifts, exposing the deep technological divide of the era. The West End is currently undergoing a visual revolution. Early electric arc lamps and blazing, hissing gas lights turn the evening streets into an artificial, golden daytime. The gentleman is surrounded by this relentless illumination. He strolls toward a grand theater, with crystal chandeliers refracting light into a million dazzling splinters. He is heavily insulated by velvet curtains and the warmth of 100 affluent bodies gathered for entertainment. His primary struggle right now is fighting off profound boredom. He is actively seeking external stimulation just to feel alive, desperate for a theatrical tragedy to briefly stir his heavily guarded emotions. That is exactly why the contrast of the East End is so jarring. As the worker finally crosses the threshold of his tenement building, the darkness is nearly absolute. The towering brick walls block out the moon, and the thick yellow fog absorbs whatever faint starlight remains. His exhausted legs drag him up narrow, rotting stairs that smell intensely of damp wood and human misery. He opens the door to a freezing, pitch-black room. There is no gaslight here. There is no electricity. There is only a single, cheap tallow candle made from rendered animal fat. When lit, it sputters violently, casting long, distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper while emitting a thick, nauseating odor of burning grease. The gentleman demands bright lights to keep his evening going, while the worker desperately craves the black void of unconsciousness just to temporarily stop the physical agony in his bones. But when that cheap tallow candle sputters out, the demons waiting in the dark require a very specific liquid cure. Part 8. The Liquid Cure. To survive the night, both classes demand oblivion. The gentleman elegantly measures out drops of pure laudanum, while the worker drowns his ruined muscles in toxic blue ruin gin. This is the quiet, desperate intersection of Victorian society, where the sheer psychological weight of existence forces both men to aggressively numb their own minds. In the plush, silent confines of his mahogany-paneled library, the gentleman reaches for a heavy crystal decanter. He is dealing with a profound existential void, a melancholy born from a life devoid of genuine struggle or purpose. His escape is a heavily refined tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. It is a highly respectable, entirely legal substance purchased from high-end apothecaries in glass vials. He measures it out onto a polished silver spoon, letting the thick ruby-red liquid slide down his throat. The drug immediately wraps his nervous system in warm velvet, slowing his pulse and detaching him from the quiet emptiness of his sprawling estate. But down in the freezing slums, the worker is not running from existential dread. He is running from searing mechanical agony. His joints are inflamed, his lungs are bleeding invisibly from cotton dust, and his ears are still ringing from the deafening roar of the looms. He cannot afford the luxury of a gentle narcotic descent. He requires a violent, immediate blackout. He spends his hard-earned pennies on cheap, unregulated gin, brutally adulterated with turpentine and traces of sulfuric acid to increase its burning potency. It tastes like industrial solvent. It scars the throat and aggressively damages the liver. But it delivers the rapid, merciless unconsciousness he so desperately needs. Society looks at the gentleman nodding off in his armchair and calls him a tragic, romantic figure burdened by the intellect of his class. Society looks at the worker passed out in the alleyway and violently condemns him as a criminal, degenerate animal. They are both actively erasing their reality, but the law only punishes the man who cannot afford a velvet curtain to hide behind. This cycle of self-destruction would merely be a personal tragedy if it weren't for the ones forced to inherit it the very next morning. Part 9. The Cruel Inheritance. The truest horror of 1880 isn't the factory itself. It's looking at your 10-year-old son and knowing the Factory Act of 1878 won't save him from the exact same mechanical slaughterhouse. We like to believe that history is an arc bending toward progress. We study the legislation and assume the worst was over. But this is the emotional climax of the Victorian nightmare. The concept of upward mobility is a meticulously crafted lie, designed to keep the underclass docile. Look closely at the gentleman's heir. He is being groomed at an elite boarding school like Eton or Harrow. He sits at a polished oak desk, learning Latin, classical history, and the intricate rules of compound interest. He is actively being trained to manage the empire, inheriting a vast portfolio of capital, property, and, most importantly, endless, unburdened time. His future is a wide, open horizon. Now, stare into the hollow eyes of the worker's child. Despite the new labor laws meant to protect him, the economic reality of the family dictates that he must earn his keep or watch his younger siblings starve to death. He is sent into the textile mills specifically because he is small. He operates as a scavenger, forced to crawl on his hands and knees beneath the massive, relentlessly spinning power looms to sweep up loose cotton and oil, while the heavy iron gears crash violently inches above his fragile skull. One miscalculated movement means a crushed spine. He isn't inheriting wealth. He is inheriting a brutal genetic debt. His young lungs are already permanently scarred by the flock in the air, his spine is beginning to curve from the unnatural labor, and his destiny is permanently locked to that exact patch of factory floor. The gentleman passes down sprawling estates and political influence. The worker passes down a broken body and a guaranteed, reserved spot at the spinning mule. Yet, the most disturbing secret of the Victorian era is the invisible thread that binds these two vastly different worlds together forever. Part 10. The Invisible Thread. As the gentleman finally drifts to sleep, he pulls a crisp white nightshirt to his chin. A garment woven that very afternoon by the bleeding hands of the worker we just followed. This is the profound macroeconomic reality of the British Empire, functioning as a flawless, terrifying machine of human extraction. We have spent this entire journey watching these two men exist in completely separate, irreconcilable dimensions. One lives in a world of silver spoons, imported claret, and electric theater lights. The other is trapped in a suffocating cycle of chalk-laced bread, toxic gin, and the deafening roar of iron machinery. It is incredibly easy to view them as isolated narratives, two parallel lines that will never, ever intersect. But that is the grand illusion of the era. They are not merely sharing the same geographical coordinates. They are locked into a profoundly parasitic relationship, where the sheer existence of one is entirely dependent on the slow, grinding destruction of the other. The gentleman's entire reality, his warmth, his soft fabrics, his quiet library, and his expansive leisure time is not spontaneously generated by his superiority. It is systematically extracted directly from the physical exertion, the lost years, and the broken bones of the East End worker. Every single ounce of luxury in Mayfair is aggressively wrung out of the desperation in Spitalfields. They lived in the exact same city. They eventually died in the exact same dirt. Yet they existed on entirely different planets, with one existing purely to serve as combustible fuel for the other's comfort. We look back at 1880 with a sense of historical relief, telling ourselves that the brutal factories, the child labor, and the toxic fog are relics of a distant, uncivilized past. The Victorian era is officially over, but the machine never actually stopped running. It just moved out of sight. So, tell me, whose unseen hands made the shirt you're wearing right now?